Today I'm going to talk about social justice, inclusive education, and teacher agency with the PJI Teachers Academy. First, a little introduction of who I am. My PhD is from UCF Public Affairs doctoral program in public administration. I hold two master's degrees, one in curriculum and instruction and in social science ed. I am a former middle school history and gifted education teacher. I was also the department chair of my social science group, so I'm very used to working with teachers as well as being a teacher. I started with PJI evaluating the class of 2018 with one of my colleagues, Rachel Mack. I attended in 2019, I'm an alumna of class 2019, which was an amazing and completely eye-opening experience. I finished my dissertation recently. I graduated in August with my dissertation on the class of 2018-2019, looking at social justice, inclusive ed, and teacher agency. And now I've been hired as the research fellow to conduct more research, including the class of 2020. So the purpose of this presentation is to share the most recent research regarding the PJI Teachers Academy. This presentation is also going to emphasize the importance of social reproduction theory in education and how to disrupt it, as well as define and elaborate on the concept of teacher agency and why it is so important in the field of social justice and education. So our agenda today, I'm going to go quickly over the background, curriculum, classrooms, and theories. Then I'll introduce the study, the results, and what this means for practice. So we'll start with the background. You most likely recognize the images of these two individuals, Harriet Tubman and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's also reasonable to assume that in schools, students learn about these two incredible individuals. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. American history standards in 9 states was studied by Journal, and he found that only 2 of the states actually included Harriet Tubman in their standards. 3 of the states mentioned Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the, it's still early for me, as the only influence within the civil rights standards. They neglected to mention anyone else during the civil rights unit. And 1 of the 9 states completely failed to recognize Dr. King in their entire US history curriculum from K-12. It doesn't end there. In Florida, 26% of the population are Hispanic or Latinx. In a review in 2019 of the 1,186 social science standards for K-12 education, only 68 reference Hispanic Latinx students and populations. 30 of those are specific Latinx historic figures. 38 are groups of people, including women in government, civil rights in Florida, where Latinx Hispanic individuals are included, but not highlighted. So we're seeing a disconnect between what the curriculum has and what the student population looks like. In Texas, only 6 standards of their entire contemporary junior year American history course, only 6 standards directly reference Latinx Americans. None of the standards identified Asian Americans or Native Americans as important historical figures. And this is an American history course. The list goes on. So why is this important other than students aren't getting a complete concept of history or the society we live in? Well, it's important because in over 3,000 public school teachers studied, 78% of math teachers and 68% of language arts teachers received their curriculum directly from their district that complied with state mandates. In Mississippi, 107 teachers were asked to choose from a list of what had the greatest influence on their daily teaching. 96.3% of them agreed that it was helping their students attain test scores to allow them to graduate high school. Only 80% agreed that it was the belief that it was the best instructional practice. Again, we're seeing a disconnect between what should be done for students and what is actually being done in the classroom. So school curriculum functions as a primary reproducer of societal beliefs and assumptions. Roof and Vizina discuss it being the beliefs, values, understanding that exist within societies. Gregory mentions that it's the curriculum that teaches us what to believe. In other words, if it's taught in the classroom, it's seen as the complete truth, and what is taught matters. Standardized standards in the States, when translated into legitimized and taught and tested content, form a singular narrative that reinforces the dominant male, middle class, white European culture. What is in the standards is what's taught in the classroom and what is what's tested and is considered important. If it's not including voices of color, women, multiple socioeconomic groups, multiple ethnicities, nationalities, it's not creating a full understanding of our world, of our society, of our classroom. So this can be seen in standards that overemphasize the role of European and white Americans and neglects the contributions and history of Asian, Black, Indigenous, Native Americans, and Latinx individuals. Social reproduction refers to the replication of power and privilege within society, and that includes economic, human, cultural, and social capital. It also rewards those who fit into the norm, the social norm of what is expected, and marginalizes those who don't. So again, state curriculum translates to lessons, academic focus, and deprives students of the opportunity to relate to the curriculum and presents an inaccurate narrative of history. This impacts all students. Identifying this is relatively easy. We can point to the standard and say, oh, we are missing voices. There's clearly an absence here, or the information is biased. But it's a little more difficult to figure out how do we disrupt this? How do we solve this? There needs to be two parts. First, daily lessons need to be cultural relevant, socially just, inclusive, accurate, and appropriate for students. But that's not all. The teachers need to feel capable and empowered to teach such a curriculum. This is known as teacher agency. So before I continue, I want to go over two quick definitions. Inclusive education in this context is very similar to multicultural education, but expanded. It's the belief that every single student, regardless of skill, socioeconomic background, gender, ethnicity, nationality, language proficiency, ability, every single student is capable of learning. Now, I know that a lot of times in education, an inclusive classroom can also mean individuals and students with different abilities. This is including them in this massive definition. So it's all students, regardless of who they are. Social justice education is not just recognizing that students have their own history, their own background, their own family situation. It's also providing students with the awareness and knowledge to examine and confront injustice in their personal lives, communities, institutions, and broader society. So the Giving Tree is a really great example of this, and I know somebody has written a new version called The Tree Who Says No. But the Giving Tree, if you look at in this example, inequality has one student who gets more apples than the other. Equality is they both have the same size ladder, but one student still can't reach the apples. Equality is not enough. Equity, the student who needs a higher ladder has it, but still has fewer apples on their side. We're getting closer, but the goal is justice, where the tree is straightened up, apples are on both sides, and both students have access. So we looked at social justice and inclusive education. Now the other definition I want to introduce is agency. Giddens describes agency as whatever happened would not have happened if the individual had not intervened. So the idea that it is our ability to act that provides agency. Bandura adds to this with, if people believe they have no power to produce results, they will not attempt to make things happen. So simply doing something is not enough. You have to believe that you can do something. In other words, this isn't a series of happy accidents. This is the belief that you can change something and that you do act so that a new reality is formed. When looking at teacher agency, Pantic worked with teachers and administrators to create a 4-part model. They identified sense of purpose. Teachers' sense of purpose. What do they believe is the reason for them to be in the classroom? Self-reflexivity. how do they look back at their practice and at the practice of their practice of teaching and how they are in the classroom? Competency. Do they feel capable of teaching the lesson? And finally, autonomy. Do they feel that they have the opportunity to move things around as they need within their classroom? So, all four of these aspects make up the sense of teacher agency. But why is this important? Looking at the classroom, you have the classroom and you have each student. Each student has their own background, their own family, beliefs, interests, ability, education, social class. This is from systems theory, which is from social work. And it's the idea that each person is part of a system that's part of a larger system while also having systems inside of them. The concept of Hollins. So you have students in the classroom. You also have teachers in the classroom, and the teachers have their own family history, beliefs, interests, abilities, etc. The classroom also has a grade level, content area standards, and the administration. These parts are all fairly static. You can't take a student and say, hey, guess what? You have a different family, or your beliefs have suddenly changed. We also can't take a teacher and say, guess what? We're changing your socioeconomic class. We are taking your interests and completely revamping them. A third grade music class cannot become a 12th grade physics lab. Content area standards are fairly hard to change, particularly for research, and the administration is fairly static. What you can research and what you do have the ability to change in the classroom are daily lessons and the teacher's sense of agency. Those are the two parts. So, wrapping it back up to my goal for the presentation, those are the two parts that we're looking at: the daily lessons and the sense of agency as a way to disrupt the reproduction of social norms within biased history in the classroom. So let's go into the study. This is the exciting part. There have been studies like this before, but very few have actually looked at the link between inclusive and social justice education and teacher agency in order to reduce social reproduction of inequity in schools. So the focus of this study was to examine if social reproduction through curriculum in public schools could be reduced by educating teachers to recognize inequity in the curriculum, promote inclusive and social justice practices, while increasing their sense of professional agency. Fortunately, the Peace and Justice Institute Teachers Academy does this. So I wanted to see, how does it work? So the setting was the Teachers Academy, which, as Lori gave a wonderful introduction to, is the week-long professional development series that focuses on a myriad of topics, including social justice, privilege, trauma-informed education, mindfulness, and inclusive ed. In 2019, the professional development sessions were repeated 3 times. The sessions had an identical curriculum, but to allow for a smaller, more intimate group, there were 3 different sessions for teachers to attend, 3 different week-long sessions. So in 2019, 75 public and private school teachers, administrators, counselors, deans, university personnel, support staff all attended the Teachers Academy during those 3 weeks. Of the 75, 27 participants worked for a single district. That district was the most heavily populated district of the participants, and 17 were employed as classroom teachers. For my dissertation, I focused on one county and only the public school teachers in that county in order to allow for a guarantee of equal district requirements. We know districts are completely different and they have a different way of enforcing policies and what the teachers need to do in their classroom. I wanted to make sure that was standardized. I also wanted to limit variability among teachers and school environment. Districts, again, are very different, and I wanted to make sure there was while within a district there is variability, I wanted to limit it to keep it within one district. And finally, I wanted to ensure consistency in participant instructional capacity. Our administrators, our deans, our support staff are incredible, but they don't have the same instructional capacity as the teachers. And I wanted to make sure I was speaking with classroom teachers and how this impacted their practice. So I had 2 research questions. The first one was a generic qualitative and quantitative question. How did their knowledge and skill set change after going to the summer session? And was this sustained over a school year? And what was the relationship between reported learned knowledge and skill set with implementation of the inclusive curriculum and teacher agency? The second question goes a little deeper into mixed methods, which I will explain when we get there. A little bit about the participants. There were 13 teachers from 6 schools. 10 of the teachers were from PJI 2019, and 3 of them came in from 2018. I had 2 elementary school teachers, 4 middle school teachers, 2 K-8 teachers, 5 high school teachers. I also, in this group, had 5 Title I teachers. 7 of my teachers in the group were identified as African American or Black. 5 were white or Caucasian, 1 Hispanic Latinx. The results. So looking at the first research question, how did their knowledge and skill set change after attending the professional development program, and was it sustained? We used the PJI Teachers Academy assessment. It is a 10-question Likert scale assessment that Dr. Anderson, Rachel Mack, and I created for the 2018 evaluation. 10 questions broken into 2 scales. One is looking at inclusive education knowledge, and the other one is looking at implementation. Participants took this before they began PJI Teachers Academy. They took it again the last day of the academy, which was great because I actually took it as well, and I had to take my results out of the sample. And then when I spoke with them again a year later, I administered the same test. So we had a pre-post and a follow-up. Looking at the averages of the participant scores, the pre-test, as you can see, is fairly low. The post-test, as expected, it's during the week of implementation, is very high. The follow-up has some attrition, but not much. This was after a year of COVID, after a year of some teachers changing their grade level, moving to a new school. To have the follow-up test still remain so high is incredible and speaks very highly to the Teachers Academy. Breaking it down into full test versus social justice knowledge and implementation, you can see again that the red line is the pretest. There is a jump for the post-test, and then a slight decline in social justice knowledge for the follow-up test, and a little bit bigger of a decline for implementation. The knowledge is staying with the teachers, and we do anticipate attrition with implementation. You have great ideas when you're in professional development. You get in your classroom and realize, how am I going to do this? That's where agency comes in. But before I get to agency, looking at these results, you can see that it is sustainable. But I also wanted to hear it from the teachers themselves. Answering 10 questions on a Likert scale test is great, but I want to hear what they said. So 11 teachers participated in recorded interviews, totaling 8 hours and 35 minutes. 2 teachers opted to email their responses. The interviews were transcribed and verified for accuracy, and then each one was coded for themes and responses. So I listened to and I looked at each interview to what were they discussing most? What were the themes of their interviews? I identified 48 unique codes, which were then divided into 3 overarching themes regarding changes to their personal lives and professional practice. The first theme is the creation of a welcoming classroom and inclusive space. My students get along like family. For those of you who are familiar with the PJI principles, and they're going to be linked in the chat in a minute, for those who are familiar with the principles, having a welcoming, inclusive space is the goal. And I noticed as I talked to the teachers, they recognized that this was a change in their classroom. Miss Adria, a second grade teacher, mentioned that her students are together more than they are with their families. She has them for 8 hours a day. This helps her class unite as a family. Mrs. Snickers, who is a kindergarten teacher, said that yes, her kids did squabble like brothers and sisters, but they stood up for each other. They got along like family. Mr. Artman, a high school teacher, proved that this isn't just an elementary theme, said that he gets to be the father and mother to his students. You guys are like my kids. We're like family. He also discussed in his interview about when the students went home for COVID, calling families and saying, "Hey, somebody hasn't done their homework in a few days. Can I talk to them?" And actually calling the students themselves and asking, "What's going on? How can I be of assistance?" He took that role of being the mother and father of the group beyond the classroom walls and into the community. Miss B, who was an eighth grade, no, sorry, she was a middle school chorus teacher, spoke about one of her eighth grade students who was having a problem at her house. And her student came in during the planning period and said, I'm having this issue, told her what was going on, and said that she didn't feel like she would be able to do that with any other teacher. She would have shut down for the day or left school to try to get home. Miss B was able to get assistance for the student, but the important thing is the student felt comfortable. She felt like that classroom was a safe and welcoming place for her to come in and explain what's going on. So the second theme looked at inclusive and social justice strategies. I've learned to stop expecting myself from others. Miss Tammy, a sophomore language arts teacher, mentioned that the biggest thing she learned from PJI, professionally and personally, is to stop expecting yourself from others. When you stop expecting yourself from others, that allows you to kind of tap into that place of wonder, where you just start asking those open-ended questions. You start suspending judgment, and it all falls into place. For those of you familiar with the principles, unprompted, she mentioned 3 of them. Miss K, who is a senior level science teacher, mentioned that the biggest thing she got from PJI was allowing the students to express themselves instead of, again, coming in from judgment and cutting them off, another principle. She mentioned that she had a fight in her classroom, and instead of just sending the students out for discipline, she waited and asked open-ended questions and said that the students were amazed that a teacher would care what's going on before rushing for discipline. Another theme, or within the idea of inclusive and social justice practices, is the idea of respecting silence. PJI helped me understand that if a student does not want to talk, it's okay. From Miss Iman, who is an 8th grade science teacher. And Mr. Artman again mentions that it's important to the developing growth of a child that they have the right to remain silent, and that we need to appreciate and respect that. I know this was something that I definitely struggled with when I was a classroom teacher. I felt that if my students were silent, they were plotting, because I had a bunch of middle schoolers, and that's unusual for middle schoolers to be silent. It's important to recognize the students' ability to remain silent and not talk in class if they choose to not share. And this came up multiple times through the interviews of teachers recognizing that it's okay, let's see what the child is going through. The final theme was understanding privilege and changes to self. You got to reach inside and see who you really are. Mrs. Snickers, the kindergarten teacher, mentioned that what hit her like a ton of bricks was white privilege. It wasn't something I ever asked for. And when I found out I had these privileges and others did not, at first I was ashamed, but now I'm more cognizant. I'm cognizant of it. She was able to take what she learned in PJI and apply it to her classroom, recognizing the privileges she has, which may not match her students. Ms. Supreme noted that she felt at PJI, she was able to express things that first felt taboo, but she found out it's okay to be angry. The facilitators at PJI helped her express her emotions and said, humans get angry. It's okay if you're angry about something, especially if you feel it's unjust. So instead of bottling it up, instead of remaining silent, she was able to open up and express her frustrations with the system as a whole, and credited PJI with that realization that it's okay for her to be angry. What's the next step? Miss Iman mentioned that PJI was the best experience she had outside of academics. You go to conferences to learn about your subject, to learn about strategies, and this was a unique experience. This was learning about humans, about people, about yourself. She shared that she had spoken with Lori before joining PJI, and Lori had mentioned, you're going to cry, and she said, cry for what? When she entered, she saw tissues and she realized that he was digging deeper. It wasn't just another professional development of learning about your content, of learning classroom management. It really was an opportunity to learn about the human condition, to learn about yourself. Finally, Miss Adria, second grade, when I asked her, how do you feel that PJI impacted you personally? She said, well, I will now tell you I'm divorced and couldn't be happier. I learned how to stand up for myself. I learned that how I was living was not normal, and my boys and I have the principles on the refrigerator and refer to them often. Life is great professionally and personally. This was literally life changing. So, from these, we see that the teachers did learn about social justice and inclusive education, both knowledge and implementation. The knowledge they gained was sustained through a year. It wasn't something that you learn after 1 week and then drops off and not used ever again. They retained the knowledge and the implementation from the training. Also, the teachers did feel a personal and professional change and connection to the material presented during PJI. Relating it back to the literature, this worked with the disruption of social reproduction, where teachers described how it opened their eyes to reproduction in the curriculum and how to stop it, how to disrupt social reproduction in their classrooms through the use of inclusive and social justice strategies. That's what we want. They also looked at disrupting through curricular changes. Mr. Artman and Miss B routinely included missing histories in their traditionally Eurocentric art and chorus classes. They used this to overcome disparities in the curriculum. And finally, they were able to disrupt through environment. By creating a welcoming and inclusive environment, they created an avenue in which a teacher can alter the classroom system. The inclusive environment allowed students to feel like they were welcomed, feel like they were heard, and they were important. After all voices matter. They were able to change the way their classroom was to replicate a community instead of just a group of individuals learning about a subject. So this was all very exciting to learn, but I wasn't done with the research. I wanted to know what was the relationship between the self-learned knowledge and implementation with the inclusive curriculum and their sense of agency. Filling out a 10-question survey is one thing, talking to me is another, but I wanted to know, how does this all reflect? What's the difference among the teachers? Why does this work better for some than others? So I used all 3 data sources: the quantitative follow-up tests, which I've already introduced, the interview responses, which we just discussed, and something called the classroom artifact inventory, which was based on interviews. When I originally wrote the proposal, I was going to go into classrooms and mark down whenever I saw things. Because of COVID, clearly we did not have classrooms, and I wasn't about to join Zoom sessions because teachers have enough stress. So I went back through the interviews, and every time one of these was mentioned, I would mark it off. So the top portion looks at knowledge, and the bottom portion looks at implementation. So did they talk about the use of silence? Did they talk about windows and mirrors? Did they talk about, which is windows and mirrors, for those of you who are not familiar with Emily Style, it's the idea that a curriculum should reflect the student's reality and provide a window into others. So they should see themselves in the curriculum as well as others reflected. As a former world history teacher, that meant not only presenting what ancient Egyptians, what their lives were like, but how would that look for our students? How could the students see themselves in there? The bottom section is looking at implementation. Did they talk about implementing outside material? Did they talk about using social justice macro and micro themes? So I created 2 totals from these, and this is where it gets a little complicated. I took the artifact to average. I totaled for each teacher. I found the average. I took the average from the artifact sheet, which I just showed you, and the average from the follow-up test for the knowledge subscale and the implementation subscale. If a teacher was above the average on artifacts and above average on follow-up, they were labeled high, high. If they were below average on both, low, low, and if they're above and below, high, low, or low, high. I don't expect you to go through all of this, but I wanted to show you what my reasoning was. We had several teachers who were high, high, three who were high, low, three who were low, high, and two who were low, low. Interestingly, they stayed the same for knowledge and implementation, with the exception of one teacher who scored higher on knowledge than implementation. So this category system was fairly accurate in determining where they would be for knowledge and implementation. I then took these four categories and I looked at the transcripts again. I've read the interviews about 30 times a piece. And this time I separated them out to, okay, this is my high, high group of teachers, my low, low. And I looked for evidence of teacher agency. Specifically, what do they consider to be their purpose as a teacher? How do they reflect on their practice? How do they incorporate social justice and inclusive education knowledge and implementation in the classroom? And how do they feel about their ability to change daily lessons in the classroom? In other words, looking at all four aspects of teacher agency. Here's what I found. The teachers who were high on the artifact list and high on the follow-up test, so they're above average on both scores, believed in the intrinsic value of helping. I always led with my heart. These 5 teachers included 1 elementary, 2 middle school, and 2 high school teachers. Their purpose was intrinsic. Why are you still in the classroom? It's because I think it's where I belong. These are the people who were born to teach. They're in the classroom. That's where they're meant to be. Their self-reflexivity. How do you reflect on your teaching practice was also intrinsic. Mrs. Iman mentioned that it's like a spiral. You're learning, you're teaching, you're sharing, you're learning again. For those of you familiar with Vygotsky's work, this is the learning spiral. It was intrinsic. It was a part of her. Their competency was high. Miss Stella told me that she would start American literature with John Smith and the settlers coming in. And after going to PJI, I was like, no, I have to start with Native Americans. I have to get their voices heard first. She credited PJI with gaining that competency to start with the Native Americans and American literature course. And finally, their sense of autonomy for all 5 teachers was very high. Ms. Snickers noted that, yes, she does have the standards, but she chooses the books. And in a kindergarten class where she talked about reading to the students a lot, which you do in kindergarten classes, choosing the books is a massive portion of that. The next group of teachers scored high on the artifact list. So when I talked about their classroom, they had a lot of the traits that I was looking for, some of them even higher than the previous group. But these 3 teachers scored low on the follow-up test. 1 elementary school teacher, 1 K-8, and 1 middle school. Their purpose was student-centered, all 3 of them. Ms. Adria mentioned that she wanted to make the students feel loved and know that they're in a safe place. Teaching comes after that. Their purpose, why they're in the classroom, is for the students. Their reflection was also student-centered. Mr. M, I don't like looking at test scores. I look at the children, how they improve, how they change their minds, how they change from the behaviors from the beginning. His reflection on how he's doing as a teacher is looking at the students. Their competency was also very high. Ms. Supreme, who is a world history teacher, said that she wanted the students to know that right now, in this moment, they're making history for themselves. She fully brought on the idea of windows and mirrors and wanted the students to see themselves in the curriculum, even though she was teaching about things that happened 4,000 years ago. Their autonomy was also high. They felt they had control in their classroom, and this was interesting compared to the group before them. They addressed their concerns to things outside of the school. Ms. Supreme mentioned that one of the criticisms she has of the education system in general was that they don't treat world history or US history the same as they treat other tested subjects, even though world history supports each one of them. Don't we need the same amount of planning days? Can we have a bit of extra funding? Is it possible to splurge a little bit? She brought in things into her own classroom, felt comfortable changing her classroom. Her questioning was about the broader system rather than looking at her administration or at the curriculum itself. So now I looked at the teachers who scored low on the artifact list. So when I went through their interviews, they didn't have as many examples, but they scored high on the follow-up test. This was also three teachers, one middle school teacher and two high school teachers. This is where we start to see a shift. Their purpose was curriculum focused. My main purpose for teaching is to be able to grow my students academically, whatever the state curriculum provides. That's a huge difference from teaching comes second or I'm here because I belong here. The reflection was also curriculum focused. When I'm teaching something, I do an assessment and I get the results. I like to analyze, I like to see the numbers if I have growth in the classes. Again, completely different from saying I look at my students and how they change. Their competency was low. Ms. Y spoke about trying to do mindfulness, using the principles as something I tried to do on a daily basis. I tried doing mindfulness, but was unable to continue because of various factors. Finally, their autonomy was low. Ms. Tammy said that her curriculum is supposed to be rigidly set because of the fact that 10th grade is tested. Sometimes I just created flexibility, and other times I have to do what the state says I have to do. These teachers internalized the curriculum. That is their main focus of teaching, not the students, not their passion, the curriculum. Finally, the low teachers. There were two of these who scored low on the artifact list and low on the follow-up test. Their belief was they wanted good test scores. They don't want kumbaya. Not them, but the royal they. Their purpose was also curriculum focused. My mantra is the three R's: relationship, rigor, relevance. Relationship's good, but I don't really know if the purpose of teaching is to provide rigor. We hear that word all the time in public education. Is that really the purpose? Their self-reflexivity. These are the only two teachers who mentioned that they didn't reflect looking at themselves. They didn't reflect at their kid looking at their students. They didn't reflect looking at the curriculum. They talked to their peers and used that as a group reflection. Their competency was also low. There were a lot of changes in the beginning of the year, and I didn't really get a chance to actually implement that aspect into my classroom for Mr. G. And their autonomy was also low. Ms. K was very frustrated, and she explained that they, the administration at their school, want numbers. They want data. They want test scores. They want, a good common final exam, or at the end, an end of course exam. They don't want, kumbaya. She had attempted to bring in things she had learned from PJI and felt that she was unable to because she was bound by the administration, belief, and test scores. So what does this all mean? Teachers who had the highest number of examples were also the ones who had a higher sense of agency, regardless of scores on the follow-up test. They also, if they had high agency, described it as intrinsically derived or their competency as a learned trait. This is exciting because we can't just have teachers who feel that they were born to teach. We need a variety of teachers, and this is a learned trait. The teachers can learn to do this. Social justice education, inclusive education practices can be fostered under the right circumstances. This was not dependent on school environment, content area, grade level, teacher ethnicity, student ethnicity, or gender. I looked at the schools, all six of them, and I had multiple participants from all but two of the schools. This allowed me to control for environment. Was it something from the school itself, or was it the teacher? I also had two Title I schools with 5 teachers from the Title I schools, and 2 schools that were a C and 4 schools that were an A. So I looked at a variety of schools. I also looked at teacher content area. 2 early elementary, so K2. I have 2.5 for math and science. One teacher was a 5th grade math and science teacher, so he's half of both. 2 language arts, 1 history, and 3 elective. Often when there's professional development sessions, the electives and history are left out. Across the board, the teachers felt that this was useful for them, regardless of the content they taught or the grade level. This wasn't all elementary or high school. This included middle school teachers. It included teachers who teach multiple levels as the two high school elective teachers and the one middle school elective teacher who saw all students. So the education from PJI was not bound by content or grade level. Finally, I looked at the ethnicity of the teacher and the ethnicity of the students. If you look at the chart, the ones that are bold, the teacher represents the majority ethnicity in the school. They had teachers with high agency and low agency who represented the major ethnicity in the school, and teachers who represented a minority ethnicity at the school also had high agency and low agency. It didn't matter. There were examples of both. So what does this mean for practice? We can support high agency in teachers. The important parts for teachers to recognize was that students' growth as an individual was the most important part of education. Students spend 13 years in K-12. Their growth as a person is way more important than if they knew what year the Civil War started. Although I would be very happy if they knew that too. The state and district standards are a content minimum and should guide rather than dictate the classroom content. It isn't the end all be all. The entire classroom cannot just be the curriculum. And as teachers, they were comfortable, capable, and felt responsible for enacting change in the classroom. I don't want to give more work to teachers. I taught for 4 years. Teachers are very stressed, but part of that stress is trying to replicate every part of the curriculum without recognizing what the students' needs are. Teachers need to be able to feel comfortable and capable of altering lesson plans and daily instruction to meet the needs of their students and ensure their students are getting the best educational experience possible, not because 3 doors down, they're also on page 42. We have to be on page 42. Teachers need to be able to feel comfortable changing their lessons. We also have to be able to counter low agency. Despite recognition of inequity, and each teacher said, well, yes, there is inequity in my classroom that I've noticed after PJI, the ones with low agency still discussed aligning their daily lessons and curriculum to the curriculum. They felt bound to the curriculum, and it was internalized as seen as their sense of purpose and their sense of reflection. I'm assuming that if you go into an undergraduate education class and say, why do you want to be a teacher? Their answer isn't going to be because the curriculum. They're not going to want to become a teacher because they want to give tests. At least I'm really hoping that's not the reason for going into education. The study also showed that when standards are considered the keystone of the curriculum, the teachers do have a lower sense of agency, and students do not get access to an accurate and complete education. So going back to my original theory that daily lessons and agency are the two parts that are alterable, I realized that this isn't completely accurate. There are two forms of the system. The teachers who have a high sense of agency have their daily lessons come from that high sense of agency. They're able to change things based on what's going on in the classroom, what's going on in the world, and how can they meet their students' needs. The teachers with low agency take their daily lessons directly from the content area standards. We're doing this today because the blueprint says so, not because it's what's best for my students today. So the study does have major implications. The first one is that professional development sessions do need to provide teachers with the opportunity to engage with the tools of social justice and inclusive education as teachers themselves and as humans themselves before sending this out into the classroom. There also needs to be time allocated for extended length professional development sessions that focus on the teacher's sense of self, reignite that passion for education, for working with students. This is more important than focusing directly only on curriculum content or classroom management. State standards need to be framed as guidelines and the minimum. Teachers need to feel encouraged and safe adding to the curriculum. And finally, while there was evidence that it didn't matter what school they were at, there were low and high agency teachers at the same school who had the same administrators, it did help to have administrators who had buy-in and felt that what they learned at PJI was important. The principals, the teachers who had school administrators who attended PJI also recognized that they had an easier time implementing new things in their classroom. There are also implications beyond K-12. Agency-related social justice and inclusive practices can be taught regardless of the individual. These practices can be taught. While we are more connected through the internet, and I'm so excited to see everyone here, we do need to set time to talk about difficult subjects and try to reach a common ground under a common set of norms. As one of the teachers said during their interview, the principles work. And finally, in order for lasting change to occur, networks need to be built. We need to have frequent opportunities to connect, discuss, and review social justice and inclusive strategies, and these need to be scheduled. There needs to be multiple opportunities for people to get together and discuss this. So a quick plug for the PJI class of 2021, if you're interested. There is a scan me button. If you hold your phone camera up to that, it will take you directly to the website. There are 3 sessions, one scheduled for May, one for June, one for July. They are all virtual this year. We're still remaining safe with COVID. And that link is available on the next slide, which is our contact information. I'm Jenny Sanjulian-Olansky. My LinkedIn and email are there. Rachel Allen is the director of the Peace and Justice Institute, and Lori, our wonderful moderator, is the PJI Academy coordinator with her email and website there. In the chat, you're also getting access to our research packet, which has a 4-page summary of what I just talked about, including different definitions, the theories, and the results, as well as 3 articles from the PJI Journal regarding Teachers Academy and the principles. That is it.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This is always incredible. I always love listening to your work. I learn something new every time. And I also am reassured about the work that I'm doing.